Ben Geman is an energy reporter at Axios, joining us today for a one-on-one interview here on Cheddar to help us all make a little bit of sense about what exactly has been going on with the U.S. and global oil market since the outbreak of the Israel-Iran conflict in recent weeks. Ben, really grateful for your time. So for any of our viewers who may have seen the headlines and are trying to make heads and tails of what's going on, give us a bit of an overview of how the conflict in the Middle East has impacted the global oil supply so far.
Absolutely, and first of all, thank you so much for having me on the program. So yeah, it's been a wild ride, but in an interesting way, perhaps not as wild as people would have expected, and I will get into that. So when this conflict began in mid-June, when Israel began striking the Iranian nuclear facilities, the price of oil, not surprisingly, shot up, right? I mean, that's going to be common in any type of, that's going to occur in any type of conflict in a region that's responsible for so much of both global oil production, but perhaps even more importantly, global oil transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And so from there, when the U.S. got involved, when the U.S. struck the Fordo facility and other facilities on Saturday, then prices shot up briefly even further. And so at the height of this conflict, or at the height of the oil market response to this conflict, we had oil prices going up by approximately $10 per barrel. And then they very quickly started to come back down, even though the Iranian parliament had threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. That's this very narrow, vital waterway between Iran and Oman that handles approximately a fifth of global oil transit. And so I think one thing that's very interesting here is that the geopolitical risk premium that was built into the price was, interestingly, not especially high given the potential risks involved. And I think that tells us a couple of different things. One is that none of the parties involved here had a huge incentive to turn this into an energy war, right? I mean, certainly it is a hot war. Any conflict like this is tragic, but at the same time, you did not have Israel striking Iran's oil export infrastructure. And similarly, you did not have Iran, either through its proxies, which have now been diminished, or directly attempting to hit Saudi infrastructure, or going forward with this effort to close or mine or impede the Strait of Hormuz. That would have required buy-in from the regime's military and political leadership, whereas what the parliament did was more, I suppose you could call it, saber rattling. And so, as a result, prices are now remarkably lower than, or approximately at where they were before this entire conflict started.
So as you and I are having the conversation, I'm looking up at the big board here at the New York Stock Exchange. I got WTI on one side, but Brent is interesting because, to your point, we're right now at about 67.50 or so. Did that kind of limited risk premium amid the backdrop of uncertainty come as a surprise to you, Ben?
It did, in the sense of, I'm a little surprised that when this conflict began, given the potential risks to crude oil flows and condensate flows, I'm a little surprised that it didn't go up a little bit, or perhaps even a lot higher. I'm not surprised by the fact that now that we've had this seeming agreement, if it holds, that we've had prices come down so very quickly.
I'm always fascinated when we have a story like this for the impact of what this means for gas prices. It's a bit of a different conversation, but it's sort of the rockets and feathers phenomenon, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have a regional conflict like this, and pretty immediately, you could see a direct correlation between West Texas Intermediate crude benchmark here in the U.S. and what that means for how much money you pay at the pump. You could very quickly see that reaction within maybe 48 to 72 hours spike up. But you don't necessarily see it de-escalate just as quickly. It goes up like a rocket and it falls down like a feather.
Yep.
What does this mean for the average person watching at home who's having enough difficulty trying to keep track of what's going on in terms of what this means for when they go to fill up their car at their local gas station?
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is occurring right on the cusp of the main summer driving season, with the 4th of July holiday just around the corner as well. I mean, certainly we are already seeing U.S. gasoline prices on the rise as a result of this movement in crude oil prices, right? I mean, a lot of things affect gasoline prices. It's pretty regional, but the biggest determinant of what you pay at the pump is that price of crude oil. And so right now, I think, the global average for a gallon of regular is about $3.22, $3.23. I think we can expect that to sort of keep going up by at least a few cents for the next few days or a week or so. But given that the spike in oil prices we saw has been fairly short-lived. I don't think that we're looking at a very kind of sustained increase in prices. And prices are, I mean, certainly for people, it's a chunk of change out of their pocket, and it's difficult for a lot of Americans to fill up. But that said, they're not especially high by sort of historical standards. And so, I think obviously this conflict has been very unpredictable. It's hard to say what will happen, but unless we see another flaring up of the hostilities, and I don't think that we're going to see a prolonged spike in prices. On the flip side of that, we've seen President Trump in recent days kind of re-upping his drill baby drill mantra. And he very much wants to sort of see two things that that sit a little bit uncomfortably next to each other, right? One is he wants there to be low fuel prices. That, I think, is his biggest political priority. On the other hand, he wants to see U.S. oil production continue to increase. Now, we are back down to about, I think we're even under 65 for WTI right now. I think, what are we at, 64 and change last time I checked? And as you mentioned as well, at that price, I would not expect to see a lot of new wells drilled, a lot of new rigs coming into action. Most analysts that I've looked at sort of U.S. oil production say, look, right now the country is at record production of about 13.4 million barrels per day. It's probably going to keep going up a little bit more for part of the year, but the Energy Information Administration, that's the Energy Department's independent stats arm, they see things starting to slide in the second half of the year, and then they're even seeing a slight decline in U.S. production in 2026, and some other analysts see that as well. And so I think that, unless the market changes in some really fundamental ways, we are not going to see a surge of production, because, I mean, look at what producers are thinking about right now, right? We've got global oil demand growth, which is still happening, but it's honestly pretty soft compared to what it's been in some past years. We have a very uncertain trade policy landscape. We have OPEC Plus adding a significant number of barrels to the market. And look, you put all those things together, mix them up as a recipe, and it is not a recipe for another big surge in U.S. crude oil production anytime soon.
I'm glad you mentioned the OPEC Plus component about this, because politically, people who followed the OPEC Plus story during the Biden administration know that increasing those production outputs was not the top priority. It was very much the other end. What should people continue to follow or be in search of for the OPEC Plus component about this, and how much does politics play a role in this? I don't just mean regional politics, but the fact that you've got a U.S. president now who is not Joe Biden. He's got a different relationship with the heads of state of those other countries, and he's much more inclined, Donald Trump is, President Trump, to use his bully pulpit to go after a lot of those countries and say, don't mess with the oil numbers. Yeah, that's absolutely right. OPEC Plus has been returning, for the last several months, they've sort of been making these incremental decisions to return about 400,000, a little bit more than 400,000 barrels per day each month. This is unwinding of some of these voluntary production cuts that 8 of their members have made. It's a pretty complex system, but basically they've been holding back a lot of barrels, as you alluded to, in years past, in order to sort of set a floor under prices and keep prices pushing upward. I think the Saudis have basically had enough of that. They want to sort of go back toward a sort of market share posture. And so I think we've got, as you're alluding to, two forces, big forces sort of rowing in the same direction, right? One is the Saudis sort of saying, look, we're going to start to bring more production back online. We don't like the fact that some of the OPEC Plus members have kind of been cheating on their quotas anyway. And you've got Donald Trump, a very important ally of the Saudis, really making it very clear that his top priority, or one of his top priorities, is lower oil prices and consequently low prices for consumers. And so I think as a result, both the internal politics within the OPEC Plus organization and the sort of broader relationship with the U.S. are both going to push that organization toward continuing to bring these barrels back online. Now look, if global demand softens even, vastly more than people have been expecting it to, there are some other things that could change the market in ways that would perhaps cause them to revisit this decision. Every time OPEC Plus announces that they are returning more barrels, they have a lot of kind of scaffolding around that announcement, talking about how this is subject to changes in the market conditions, and this is an iterative process, and we could sort of turn on a dime and change our mind. But that said, they've been pretty consistent in recent months with the sort of level of barrels they are returning, and I would expect that to continue. Yeah, fascinating conversation at a really important time. Ben Geman, energy reporter at Axios. Ben, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on.